The notice had been pinned to the board outside the general store in Moose Jaw on a Wednesday in late September, between a call for an experienced teamster and a faded offer of 2 heifers for trade. She read it while the wind off the flats moved through her coat, as though the wool weren't there at all. Widow preferred, 2 children, boy of 8, girl of 4. Capable woman sought for household management. Ranch work not required. Ridgewood District, Saskatchewan. Inquire care of Postmaster Ridgewood. She had not been a widow long. 8 months. Her husband had taken fever in January and was gone by February, which was the way of things in a winter that didn't care what it cost you. The farm had been rented, not owned, so there was nothing to settle and nothing to keep, only the lease to return, and the landlord to thank for his patience, and the long walk back to town with her trunk and her sewing box, and the particular emptiness of a woman who has stopped planning ahead. She answered the notice that evening from the parlor of the boarding house where she'd been staying since spring. She wrote 2 sentences. She was 31, a widow, capable with children and with a household. She would come if the arrangement was reasonable. His reply took 9 days and said almost nothing. The position is yours if you want it. Come before the 1st of October. I will meet the noon train. She came before the 1st of October. The train from Moose Jaw to the Ridgewood flag stop was 4 hours through country that flattened itself out by degrees until there was nothing but sky and grass and the occasional elevator standing up out of the plain like a thought someone had left behind. She watched it through the window without looking away. She had grown up on the prairie. She knew what it asked of people, and she had, over the years, decided she was willing to give it. The flag stop at Ridgewood was a platform, a water tower, and a grain elevator with the paint coming off the south side in long strips. There was a wagon pulled to the side of the road beyond the platform, a bay mare in the traces, and a man standing at the wheel with his arms crossed, watching the train slow. He was taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything. Dark-haired, beginning to go gray at the temples, with the look of a man who had been working since before dawn and intended to work until dark, and was taking this hour as an interruption he had agreed to, but not entirely planned for. He watched her come down the steps with her trunk. He did not move to help her. She set the trunk on the platform and looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them smiled. He said his name. She said hers. He said the children were at a neighbor's and he'd collect them on the way back. She said that was fine. He lifted her trunk into the wagon bed without asking. She climbed up herself. The road north was rutted from the last rain, and the fields on either side had been harvested, the stubble pale and flat under a sky that had gone the color of pewter. She did not make conversation, and neither did he. She spent the time looking at the land the way she looked at any new thing, trying to understand what it required. The ranch came into view over a low rise. A house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a cluster of spruce along the north side planted as a windbreak, and doing the job with varying degrees of success. The house was 2 stories, wood frame, with a covered porch that had weathered unevenly. The paint had held on the south wall. It had not held elsewhere. The kitchen garden was still standing in frost-bitten rows, the cabbages taken in, but the bean poles left standing empty, their twine unraveled and lifting in the wind. She noted the stovepipe. She noted the shape of the woodpile by the side door. She noted the kitchen window and what she could see through it from the lane. He showed her the house without ceremony. Kitchen, parlor, the room that would be hers off the back hallway. A stove in the kitchen that was newer than she expected, cast iron with a warming shelf, and the pipe clean and straight through the ceiling. She opened the firebox door. The iron was sound. She closed it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her look at his stove. She did not turn around. She asked where the wood was kept, and he said there was a cord under the lean-to and another half-cord by the back door. She asked if he had split any kindling. He said the boy had been splitting it after school. She said that was good. The room he showed her was small and had 1 window facing east, a cot, a hook on the wall, and a shelf someone had put up slightly crooked but with care, as though they'd wanted it to be right. She set her bag on the cot and looked at the shelf. It was empty. She put nothing on it yet. She would need to see the rest of the house before she decided where things belonged. He collected the children from the neighbor's place. A woman named Mrs. Harrow, who lived 2 miles east and who looked at her from across the yard with the careful expression of someone who had been waiting to form an opinion and was now beginning to form it. She nodded at Mrs. Harrow. Mrs. Harrow nodded back. They did not speak. The boy was 8 years old, dark-haired like his father. And he climbed out of the wagon and looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was not welcoming either. It was the expression of someone who had learned to withhold judgment as a form of protection. His name was Ellis. His sister, Willa, was 4.5, blonde and uncertain, and she held the side of the wagon for a moment before climbing down, then walked directly to her father and stood behind his leg without looking at the woman who had come. She said it was very good to meet them and left it there. She did not ask them to shake hands or to smile or to make anything easier than it was. She turned and went into the kitchen to start supper. She found onions in the cellar and a crock of salt pork and a sack of flour. She had the onions and salt pork in the pot before he'd finished putting the mare up, and she had biscuits in the oven by the time Ellis came in and sat at the table without washing his hands. She handed him the soap and the basin and pointed to the shelf where the towel hung and said nothing else. He looked at her for a moment, then did as she'd indicated. Willa came in from the hall and watched from the doorway. They ate. He said the food was good. She said the biscuits needed a hotter oven next time. He looked at her and did not say anything, and she looked back at the table and they finished the meal. After supper, she washed the dishes and listened to him read to the children in the parlor. He read haltingly, stopping on the longer words which she noted and did not comment on. Willa fell asleep partway through, and he carried her upstairs, and Ellis went to bed without being asked, which told her something. He had learned a long time ago to manage himself. She stood at the kitchen window in the dark. For a few minutes after the house went quiet, the spruce trees along the north made a dark shape against a darker sky. The wind had picked up, and she could hear it against the eaves looking for gaps. She sat down at the kitchen table with the small notebook she carried in her bag and wrote down what she had seen and what she needed to know. The stove, sound, the woodpile. Adequate for now, not for deep winter. The children, guarded. The house, in use but not organized. The kind of disorder that comes not from neglect, but from too many things being managed by one person who did not have enough time for any of them. The ledger on the shelf above the sideboard. She had seen it when she set the table, spine out, the name of the feed merchant stamped along the cover. She had not touched it. She would need to touch it eventually, but not tonight. The first week was a matter of learning the order of things. She rose before the children and had the stove going and coffee made before he came in from his first round of the barn, which was always at 6:15, which she learned by the third morning, and had his cup waiting on the corner of the counter where he could find it without looking. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. She found her footing with Ellis by asking him things she actually wanted to know. The names of the section roads, which neighbors had dogs, whether the ice on the slough east of the fence was safe yet. He answered because the questions were real questions, not the kind adults ask to make children feel useful. By the end of the first week, he was telling her things before she asked, which was its own kind of thing. Willa came to her more slowly. She watched from doorways and from behind the kitchen table, and from the corner of the parlor where she had arranged a small collection of things. A flat stone, a strip of red ribbon, 2 wooden spools, into a private geography that made sense only to her. She did not explain it. She did not expect to be asked. On the 9th day, Willa brought one of the spools to the kitchen and set it on the edge of the table while she was rolling out pastry. She put it there without a word and stood and watched. She rolled the pastry without stopping and said the spool could stay there if it liked. And Willa stood a while longer and then went back to the parlor. But she left the spool behind. She counted that. October moved through the district in the usual way. Bright, cold mornings, short days, the smell of snow that hadn't arrived yet but was making up its mind. He was out from first light until dark managing the cattle, a herd of 60-some head that wintered on the lease land east of the home quarter. He came in tired and ate and said little. She cooked and managed the children and kept the house and did not yet feel she had the standing to say what she was beginning to understand about the household's situation. The ledger told her. She had taken it down one evening while the children were asleep, and he was in the barn doing the last check. She read it the way she would read anything that was trying to show her something, not looking for a single answer, but looking at the shape of the whole. The numbers were not complicated. What they showed was a slow leak. Feed costs recorded in the ledger were 30% higher in the last 2 years than the same inputs from the years before, though the herd size had not changed. A man named Broder had been listed as hired hand from spring through August of this year. The feed purchases stopped after August. Broder, it seemed, had moved on. She sat with the ledger for a long time. The discrepancy was steady, not random. It was the kind of number that implied a hand in the till, not a bad season. She was not certain, but she was close enough to certain that she wrote down the figures she wanted to compare, put the ledger back on the shelf exactly where she had found it, and said nothing. She needed one more set of receipts before she was sure. November came in cold and stayed that way. The first real snow fell on the 6th and was a foot by morning, the kind of November snow that tells you it means to stay. She packed the gaps along the north kitchen wall with strips she cut from an old wool coat she'd found in the cellar. He came in one afternoon and saw what she was doing and looked at the wall and didn't ask. She said it was letting cold in around the baseboard. He nodded and went back out. Ellis caught a cold that moved into his chest, and for 4 days she kept him home from school and had him sleep on the daybed near the stove and made him drink broth she kept warm all day in the small pot on the back burner. He was not a good patient. He wanted to argue with everything, and she let him argue and then didn't change what she'd decided. By the 4th day, he was arguing with less conviction, which meant he was getting better. She told him so, and he looked briefly pleased and then tried not to look pleased, which was the most childlike thing she'd seen him do. Willa, during those days, moved into the kitchen and sat at the corner of the table doing the small things she did. Sorting buttons, drawing shapes in the condensation on the window, and occasionally looking at her brother with an expression that was too old for 4.5. She had seen him sick before was what that look said. She had learned how it went. She made sure Willa drank her milk warm in the evenings and put a hot water bottle at the foot of her bed without being asked, and Willa accepted it without comment. A week later, Willa brought the flat stone from her corner collection and set it on the kitchen windowsill beside the spool. She was building something. She didn't explain it and wasn't asked to. December. He drove into Ridgewood the Thursday before Christmas for supplies, and she gave him the list she'd made. She had kept it to what was needed. She had not put lamp oil on the list because she'd found 2 full cans in the cellar behind the coal oil heater, and she had not put kerosene down because what was left would last through January if they were careful, and she intended to be careful. He came back with the list filled and a paper-wrapped parcel he set on the table and did not explain. Inside was a length of flannel, dark green, folded around 3 spools of thread in colors that were close to right and clearly chosen by someone who did not know it exactly but had tried. She held the flannel for a moment and set it aside and said thank you. He said it was nothing. She made the children each a pair of mittens from it before the end of the week. Willa put hers on immediately and did not take them off for 2 days. After the new year, she told him about the ledger. She waited until the children were in bed and the kitchen had gone quiet, and she set the figures she had written on the table in front of him and explained what she'd found and how she'd found it. She did not frame it as accusation. She told him what the numbers showed and what she thought it likely meant and where the receipts were that would either confirm it or put her wrong. He looked at the figures for a long time. He turned the paper as if the angle might change what was written on it. He said Broder had worked for him for 3 seasons. He said he'd never had any reason to question it. She said she understood that. She said the numbers didn't care about reason. He was quiet for a while. He poured a second cup of coffee and did not drink it. He looked at the wall above the sideboard where the ledger sat. He said he didn't know what to do with what she'd told him. She said there were 2 things. The provincial registry in Regina would have the receipts for the year previous if the merchant had filed them correctly. And the feed merchant himself, a man named Garfield who ran the co-op in town, would have copies going back 5 years. She had met him at the dry goods 2 weeks ago, and he had the kind of filing system a person could rely on. He looked at her. She had been in Ridgewood twice since she'd arrived, and she had already assessed the reliability of the merchant's records. He said, "You've been here 3 months." She said, "I know." A silence followed that was not uncomfortable and not easy. He turned the paper back to its original angle. He said he'd drive in to see Garfield on the Thursday. She said she could go with him if it would help. He said he knew she could. The Thursday was clear and cold enough that her breath came in clouds before she'd reached the wagon. Ellis wanted to come, and she said next time, and he accepted this with the particular resignation of a child who has learned that next time is usually true. Willa stood in the porch doorway in her green mittens and watched them go. Garfield was a compact man with reading glasses on a chain and a ledger for every year going back to 1887. He found the discrepancy before they finished their coffee. He had the receipts and the difference was plain, and he had in fact wondered, but Brodeur had collected in person every time, and Garfield had not felt it was his place to say. He was sorry. He said it directly to both of them. She liked him for that. On the drive back, the sky had gone the white-gray that meant snow by evening. He was quiet for the first mile, and she let him be quiet. He was working through something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins without tension but without ease. He said finally that the amount Brodeur had taken was enough to have replaced the east barn roof. It was enough to have bought out the lease on the far quarter. It was 3 winters of what he had thought were simply bad margins. She said she was sorry. He said it wasn't her fault. She said she knew. She said she was sorry anyway. The snow came in the evening as promised, and the world went white and quiet, and she stood at the kitchen window after the children were in bed and watched the yard disappear into it. There was something settling about a proper snowfall. It covered everything equally. It asked nothing of you except to wait. She heard him come into the kitchen behind her. He stood at the table for a moment, then came to stand near the window. Not close, just close enough. He said he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure where to start. She said she was listening. He said he had put an advertisement out because he needed someone who could manage a household with 2 children. And he had not thought beyond that. He had expected competence and had received something he did not have a word for. He said he'd been watching her for 3 months, trying to find the edges of what she could do, and he hadn't found them yet. She looked at the snow. He said the house had not run like this in years. Not since, he stopped. Not in years, he said again. She turned from the window. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not comfortable exactly but present, the way a person stands when they have decided to stay somewhere instead of leaving. She asked if he was saying something or asking something. He thought about it. He said he supposed it was closer to asking. She looked at him a moment. 3 months of early mornings and cold trips to the root cellar and Ellis's arguments, and Willa's slow, careful trust, and the stone and the spool on the windowsill, and the green mittens and the ledger, and the figures she'd copied out by lamplight, and the drive to Garfield's office, and the snow coming down now, even and quiet, covering everything the same. She said she had not come here with any particular plan beyond the winter. She had come because she needed a place, and it had been the most honest advertisement she'd read. He said he had tried to be honest. She said he had been. Pause. The snow against the glass was almost nothing, just a sound barely there. She said she would stay through spring if he wanted her to, and then they could say what came after spring when spring came. He looked at her. He said he thought that was the right approach. She turned back to the window. After a moment, he went to the stove and added a piece of wood without being asked, and she heard the firebox door close and then the sound of him pulling out the chair he always sat in and sitting down. She stayed at the window a little while longer. Then she turned and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee while the snow covered the yard and the road and the fields and the east barn roof that needed replacing, and all the things they had not yet said. Spring came the way it always did in Saskatchewan, sudden and determined, the snow going off the south slopes first, the creek running loud along the bottom of the east pasture. She put the kitchen garden in on the 15th of May, which was the right date for that quarter of land, and Ellis helped her measure the rows without being asked, and Willa walked behind them, dropping seeds into the shallow trenches with her green mittens set aside in the grass, her small hands working carefully over the turned earth. She stood at the end of the garden row that afternoon with her hands on her hips and looked at what they'd done. The soil was dark and damp and smelled like everything that was only beginning. Ellis stood beside her. He said, "Do you think it'll come up?" She said, "It'll come up." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you measured the rows straight, and straight rows make good gardens." He considered this, deciding whether it was true. Mrs. Harrow stopped her on the road in June and said the place was looking fine. Said she'd heard from more than one person that the cattle were doing better this year and the kitchen garden was the best kept in the district. Said it the way people say things when they mean something more than what they're saying. She thanked her and kept walking. He finished the east barn roof in the second week of June with lumber bought on account at the mill in Ridgewood, the account having room for the first time in 3 years. He worked without help, which she knew was his way, and she did not offer help and did not suggest it. She heard the hammer from the kitchen in the evenings after supper, and she let the sound be what it was, a man fixing something that had needed fixing for too long. The evening he finished, he came in and washed his hands and sat at the table, and she put supper in front of him, and they ate in the quiet that had become their quiet. Not the quiet of two people with nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who had said enough of the right things that the silence between them was no longer a space to fill but a place to rest. Ellis talked through most of the meal about the mayor's new foal and about a boy at school who had done something that required a detailed explanation. And Willa listened with her chin in her hand and her green mittens folded beside her plate, because she still brought them to the table, though the weather no longer required it. After the children were in bed, he came back to the kitchen and said her name, which was something he had only started doing in the last few weeks, and she looked up from the mending she'd taken out. He said he wanted to say one more thing about the winter, about the ledger. She set the mending down. He said he had thought, after 3 years of thin margins, that it was simply the way things were. He had stopped looking for a reason, because he had been afraid of what looking might show him. She had looked without being asked to, and without flinching at what she found. She said she had only done what seemed obvious. He said most obvious things don't get done. She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the sound of the June evening coming in through the window screen. She said she intended to stay past spring, if that was still all right with him. He said it was more than all right. He said it in the plain way he said everything, without ornament, and for that she was grateful. Outside, the cattle moved in the east pasture, and the spruce along the north side stood in the long evening light, and somewhere along the creek a frog started up, and then another, and then many, the sound of them filling the yard the way it always did in June, reliable and unchanged. Willa had left her stone and her spool and her strip of red ribbon on the kitchen windowsill, the collection grown now to 7 things: a blue glass button, a folded piece of birch bark that Ellis had found and given her without explanation, and a small gray feather that nobody had noticed her add. She looked at those things on the windowsill for a moment. Then she picked up her mending and kept on. The lamp burned low and she did not turn it up. He stayed at the table. The frogs went on outside, and the spruce trees stood, and the new barn roof held against the dark, and neither of them was in any hurry to be anywhere else.